We are going to discuss chapter 12 next. In chapter 12, we will review how banks and other financial institutions that generate deposits, how do they manage these deposits and how do they price the deposits. We will talk about the different deposits, the change in mix of deposits. We will spend a little bit of time on pricing the deposit services, and then we will spend more time on pricing deposits by looking at problem number 5 at the end of the chapter. Rules, regulations, and so forth. Deposits are a key element for financial institutions. Deposits provide liquidity. Without deposits, financial institutions cannot lend money. They cannot invest in securities. Deposits have become a very challenging task to raise. The reason why it has become more and more difficult to raise deposits is because of the fact that individuals and businesses now have alternative products that they can invest in, such as stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. If you ask someone who is 70 years old today, what portion of their wealth, net worth, was in bank deposits, that person will say that 90% of the net worth was in deposits. If you ask somebody who is 50 years old, what percentage of the net worth are in deposits and how much of the net worth are in investments, that person will say only 50% of the net worth is in bank deposits, 50% in stocks, bonds, mutual funds. Now you ask yourselves, when you are ready to invest and save, what percentage of your net worth will be in bank deposits and what percentage of your net worth will be in investments? And the answer is only 10%. So in your case, 90% of your net worth will be invested outside of deposits. In the case of the 70-year-old, 90% of the wealth was in deposits, only 10% was investments. In your case, 90% is in investments, only 10% deposits. So you can imagine how difficult it is for financial institutions to raise deposits when there are other investment products. There are two types of deposits, transaction and non-transaction. Transaction deposits are checking accounts. Those deposits where you would deposit and withdraw frequently, such as a checking account or a savings account. Non-transaction deposits are those that are longer term and carry higher interest rates. These deposits are time deposits, certificate of deposits. Transaction deposits are accounts used primarily to buy something on a regular basis, such as buying some clothes, going to Tim Hortons and buying a cup of coffee, or whatever. Non-transaction deposits are long-term deposits. Transaction deposits do not pay interest, checking accounts. Only a few banks provide interest on checking accounts to individuals. As we talked about before, checking accounts to businesses do not earn interest. Therefore, non-transaction, other deposits are non-interest bearing and interest bearing. Interest bearing demand deposits are no longer being offered. They are all non-interest bearing now. There used to be interest bearing deposits offered by the regulators. Now they don't. They're not allowed to. What are non-transaction deposits? These are long-term in nature. They are time deposits, savings deposits, retirement products, which is individual retirement accounts, etc. These are longer-term products getting higher interest rates. But they do not incur transactions, because once you deposit the money in a time deposit, until they mature, you leave the money there pretty much. Okay. Composition of deposits. Typically, institutions would prefer high proportion of transaction deposits. So banks prefer more checking account deposits because they do not pay interest. Yes, it's always good to have time deposits, but they do have to pay interest. So if they had a preference, they would prefer more transaction deposits where they do not pay interest. We'll talk about deposit pricing later on. This slide is very important, number 8, please. I could ask a couple of multiple choice questions. These show from 1983 to 2010, almost 17-year trend. It shows non-interest and interest-bearing deposits, which adds up to 100%. We're going to focus on 2010. Interest-bearing and non-interest-bearing. By the way, these are the same 100%, except they are broken up into transaction and non-transaction. So these are the same deposits. These are interest-bearing and non-interest-bearing, transaction and non-transaction, and these are the deposits displayed in the form of checking, savings, and time deposits. So these are the same 100% deposits, except they are represented differently. So if you look at the trend, in 1983, 38% of the deposits were non-interest bearing. They did not pay interest. 62% paid interest. If you remember, in 1983, a regulation was passed. We talked about it in chapter 3. In 1983, a regulation was passed deregulating interest rates, whereby banks and all financial institutions were allowed to offer market interest rates starting in 1983. As a result of that, we find that many customers closed their non-interest bearing checking accounts and deposited their money, their funds, in interest bearing because they were paying higher interest rates. Because of the fact that interest rates on deposits rose, more funds were moved from non-interest to interest. And you can see the trend stabilizing after that. So there was a big drop between 1983 and 1987, almost half. The non-interest bearing deposits dropped to half and interest bearing deposits went up because now banks were paying market interest rates on deposits. Transaction deposits. As you recall, transaction deposits are checking account. Same thing happens. Checking account deposits, less money was left in checking account deposits because people moved more money from checking to savings and time deposits because they were offering higher rates. However, the growth was gradual. It took until in the 1990s before the drop increase started to occur. Okay? Where we find that checking accounts declined, savings and time deposits increased. Again, because of regulation. Today, only 12% of the deposits are in checking accounts. 88% are in time deposits and savings account. It was 32% in 1983 and 68%. Let's look at the percentage in demand deposits. Of course, we know that transaction deposits declined from 31.9 to 12.3. These are transaction deposits. Transaction deposits declined from 25% to 8%. However, savings deposits increased because these were offering money market rates. They increased from 30% to 64%, almost doubled. While the checking account deposits declined proportionally, savings deposits increased. And time deposits, by the way, also declined. The reason why we had a big drop in time deposit accounts in the year 2000s, they dropped from 37 to 33. They went up for a while, and then they dropped off again because interest rates dropped from 1998 to 2001. They went back up in 2007, and then the financial crisis occurred and rates went down, and therefore funds were transferred from time deposits into short-term money market, just so that customers could leave their money in the short term in expectations that rates are going to rise soon. So they moved the money out of time deposits, which were paying lower interest rates, into money market. So this is a very important slide, please. Let's talk about pricing. The pricing of deposits, obviously, is been in place since the 1933s. There are different pricing methods that are used by financial institutions. We will discuss more the one pricing strategy that most banks use when we review the problem next. The Depository Institution Deregulation Act, this is the act that we talked about in Chapter 3. We just talked about this a few minutes ago. It was 1980 when the act was passed, which deregulated interest rates. However, the actual result of that act was not until 1983. And as of 1987, we find the fact that non-interest-bearing deposits declined, and because more deposits were paying higher interest rates, these went up. And that was known as Depository Institution Deregulations Act, which we studied in chapter number 3 as well. One of the pricing techniques is cost plus pricing. This is typically used by all companies. This is the operating cost plus profit. Banks do the same thing, all institutions. They look at the cost, and then they add a profit margin, the planned profit margin, to determine what rate would be offered. The next one is called marginal cost. This is the most important in terms of the method used today. Most banks use marginal cost. Marginal is defined as incremental. What marginal means is that if you deposit money in my bank today compared to yesterday, your interest rate or deposit will be different. So the question is, for every incremental dollar deposits you're bringing into my bank, what is the interest rate? As market rates rise, the interest you earn goes up. Market rates fall, the interest rate goes down. So that's the incremental interest rate on new deposits. And every day the rates change. Marginal is incremental. You don't need to be concerned about these formulas again. We'll be going through some calculations in the problem. These are not required. Neither is this formula required by you. Okay. This is going to be the problem we're going to be looking at. We will lay this problem out at the end of the chapter. So please do study this. This is a good example of the type of problem you'll be asked in the exam. Slide number 12. Marginal also involves conditional pricing. Conditional pricing means the fact that the bank is willing to give you a higher interest rate on condition that you deposit higher balances. If you deposit less balances, we will charge you a fee. If you deposit more money, we will not charge you a fee. So it's a conditional based upon how much deposits are being deposited, the funds that are being deposited. So pricing is dependent upon deposit. Fees, rates are dependent upon amount of deposits. That's conditional, on condition. This is a good example of banks. Bank A requires no fees, but they charge $5 if your balance is between $300 and $599. While this bank will charge you $3.50 per month if your balance is less than $500. So they have different gimmicks different pricing based upon different transactions. That is called conditional pricing. Okay. Okay. Let's look at relationship pricing, the next method. Relationship pricing means if you as a customer have more products purchased from my bank, you have a checking account, savings account, credit card, insurance, bonds, stocks, mutual funds. You have a loan from my bank, car loan. The more products you buy, we have now formed a good relationship between you and the bank. We will give you discounted pricing. We will charge you less interest on your loans. We will give you higher interest on your deposits. We will not charge you any of these fees, no fees. You are waived completely. Doesn't matter what your balance is. So relationship pricing is become a very important tool to attract customers to bring all their business to the same bank. Rather than you going to an insurance company, rather than going to Geico to buy car insurance, you can come to us to buy car insurance. So the more products you buy, the better the pricing. Okay. Customers have a choice. Most customers choose a bank not because of pricing or rates. Most customers choose a bank, studies show, is because it is convenient for them. And I'm sure many of you will agree to that. Okay? Many individuals look at the safety. How safe is the bank? What kind of products and services is the bank offering? What are the fees? And are they offering interest rates on high deposits, high deposit rates? So these are in order, typically. Okay. Convenience, availability of services, how safe is the institution, fees, and deposit rates. Finally, basic lifeline. This is a product, this is a pricing that is used by banks and institutions only for those individuals who have low income. This is not for students. This is not for anybody else except those individuals that have earned very little income at all, and they have big families. These are lifeline, means the fact that the bank is required to offer low-priced products, very basic banking products, simple banking products to these individuals, charging them very little or no fees at all. That is a regulatory requirement. Now, these are regulations. Please note the fact that these are not required for you to know this, but it is good for you to kind of review them if you are interested in these. Truth in Savings Act. What that means is it was passed in 1991. Banks are required to give you documentation when you open up an account. You may choose to read it or you may choose not to read it. These documentations explain fees and rates. Okay. Questions, please. Well, you can't ask me any questions, sorry. I'm used to saying that in the class. Okay. Let's look at the problem, number 12.5, please. 12.5, this is on using what is known as marginal pricing method. The most important method used by banks today. Please note, marginal is incremental. Now, the items that are listed here in black, the expected inflows, these are given to you in the problem. The bank expects to raise deposits up to $600 million. So please keep in mind, these deposits are in millions. in increments of 100 up to 600. The interest rate offered to you, the customer, will rise as more deposits are issued, because it becomes more and more difficult to raise more deposits. To provide you an incentive, the bank will offer higher interest rates, which will rise from 2% to 3.25% per year. The next thing that is given to you in the problem is marginal revenue. This is the interest income the bank earns on the $600 million of deposits. The bank will earn 4.25%. So when they lend the money out or invest those deposits, the bank's revenue will be 4.25%. However, their interest expense will rise from 2% to 3.25%. What we are asked to determine the profit or the loss, and your task is to determine how much should the bank raise. Should they raise 100, 200, or 600? We will do that. The first thing you should do, this is very, very important in the exam, please. Please make sure you add an extra column on the left-hand side. And note this as incremental deposits, inflows, in millions of dollars. Incremental means extra. What this means is that the first 100 is $100 million. To go from 100 to 200, it has gone up by 100. So 200 minus 100 is 100. 3 minus 2 is 100. 400 minus 300 is 100. So these are incremental deposits, an increase from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. Make sure you have this column. We'll be using this column quite a bit to do the calculations. Now, here's the next step. We are now calculating what is known as the total interest cost in millions. Interest is 0 today. The first $100 million, if you multiply that by 2%, 2% of 100 million is 2 million. 200 million times 2.25% is 4.5 million, and so on and so forth. 300 million times 2.5% is 7.5 million. 600 million times 3.25% is $19.5 million. So this is the total interest the bank will pay depending upon whether they raise 100, 200, or $600 million. The next thing we need to calculate is the marginal. The word marginal, this is the total, the marginal interest. Keep in mind, marginal is incremental. Incremental means how much more is the interest paid by the bank under these conditions versus previously. So previously there was 0 interest. Now the bank is paying $2 million, and therefore the difference between 2 and 0, 2 minus 0 is 2 million. The next one is 4.5 on 200 million. How much more is the bank paying incrementally? 4.5 minus 2 is 2.5. 7.5 minus 4.5 is 3. So we are looking at the difference between the two. Difference between 0 to 2, 2 to 4.5, 4.5 to 7.5, and so forth. So we find that marginally the interest goes up, mainly because the rate had gone up. 2 million, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5. That is the marginal interest cost of deposits. Then we convert the dollar interest cost into marginal interest rate, percentage. So these are dollars and these are percentage. Please note the fact that because this is marginal, this amount, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5, they are not on 600. These interest costs, this is on the total. Marginal interest is only on $100 marginal deposits. So the first $100 million is $2. The next $100 million is 2.5. Next 100 is 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5. So in order to calculate the percentage interest, we divide this column by this column. We divide the red by blue. 2 divided by 100 is 2%. 250 divided by 100 is 2.5. 3%, 3.5, 4. 450 divided by 100 is 4.5%. Please keep in mind that in the exam, these will be incremental, will be the same amount. I will not ask you that this will be 25, 50, 100. I will not confuse you that way. So please note that these will be equal incremental because they will go up by the same amount, very similar. So therefore, we are dividing each of the dollar amount of interest by $100 million, and the interest rate is 2%, 2.5, up to 4.5%. This is the marginal cost in terms of percentage. This is the marginal revenue in terms of percentage. This is given to you. This will be given to you. This you are calculating. The next step is we now need to determine the difference. Revenue minus expense. 4.25% minus 2%. 2.25. 4.25%, which is a fixed, minus 2.5%. 1.75. 4.25 minus 3, 1.25. What we find is the fact that these here we are generating more revenue than expense. Higher revenue than expense. So the profit is 2%, 1.75, rather 2.25, 1.75, 1.25, 0. It's a declining revenue. The profits is declining because while revenue remains the same, interest cost goes up. Up until the last $600 million. Here, the interest cost is 4.5%. The revenue is only 4.25. Therefore, the cost is higher than the revenue. We have a negative 0.25%. Positive, positive, this is negative. Now, the final column we need to calculate is what is the total profit, cumulative. Please keep in mind this is cumulative total profits. To do that, we have to determine the profits based upon the difference. 2.25, 1.75, and so forth. We now have to multiply the difference times $100 million and accumulate it. So for example, we will take $100 million, multiply that by 2.25% profit, which is 0.225. $2.25 million profit. We take the $2.25 million and we carry that forward because we're trying to arrive at the cumulative. We add to that $100 million, an additional $100 million. However, the profit is only 1.75%. The next one. 1.75 times 100 million is 1.75 million plus 2.25 is $4 million. We now take $4 million and carry that forward, accumulate it. That's your basis, 4 million. Next one is 100 million times 1.25%, which is 1.25 million plus 4 is 5.25. So we are increasing our total cumulative profit to 2.25, 4, 5.25, $6 million, because we are increasing at 0.75. We are now increasing another 0.25. We go from 6.25 to $6.25 million profit, because it's 0.25% on $100 million. However, the very final, we are reducing our profits, so there is a loss. So now we have $100 million times negative 0.25%. And that will reduce your profit by 0.25. Therefore, the profit goes down from 6.25 million, which is carried forward, minus 0.25, we'll be back to 6 million. So it goes up from 2.25 to 6.25 and goes back down to $6 million. The question is, how much should the bank raise in deposits? The bank will raise deposits based upon the highest cumulative profit. The highest cumulative profit is earned up to $500 million, 6.25 million. Because after that, the bank is incurring the loss. So they will raise enough deposits to make $6.25 million, and they will not raise the 100. So they will only raise 500 million total. Please make sure the fact that you study this very carefully. Do the math. You will be required in the exam, please, to make sure you know these columns. You must know exactly how the columns are laid out. You must memorize the columns. If you miss one column, the whole problem will be incorrect. So you must know this thoroughly. And every column must be there. Please make sure, do not forget to include one column called incremental inflows. You will be given this column, but not this. So you want to make sure you do that, because as you saw, we use this calculation along the way. That concludes chapter number 12.